Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event, the genre of graphic novel, Student Activism Then and Now, is the kickoff for QCC's 2021 Welcome Read. You'll hear from Dr. Robin Ford, Associate Professor of English, and Professor Sybil White, who will both discuss March, Book 1, The Graphic Memoir by John Lewis. This event is a collaboration between the KHC and QCC's English Department, pre-college programs, and the Center for Tutoring and Academic Support. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock peoples who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's discussion is also connected to the KHC's newest exhibition, The Concentration Camps, Inside the Nazi System of Incarceration and Genocide. Due to CUNY's COVID-19 campus access and social distancing protocols, the KHC will not be offering group tours for this semester. However, you are absolutely welcome to come stop by and visit the exhibition on your own, and we'd like to give you a sneak peek. This exhibition is the largest one the KHC has ever mounted. We have a tradition of doing originally researched exhibitions. What you'll find is that this exhibition focuses on imagery from the concentration camps, and we also have used different materials, including bricks, stones, and iron gates that are evocative of what was used in concentration camps and in barracks, as well as cattle cars. The exhibition is in 6 different sections, the first of which focuses on the strategy of the system. And there's 2 important points to recognize about this exhibition. The first is that this is a system of incarceration of approximately 44,000 different camps and ghettos, starting with police stations and detention centers through concentration, forced labor, brothels, and extermination camps. The second part is to talk about the 6 million Jewish people who were murdered in these camps and the millions more people who were also tortured and killed by the Nazis, including the LGBTQI plus population, Roma and Sinti, political prisoners, Polish citizens, Slavic people, and many more. It features 13 original video testimonies with survivors, Holocaust survivors from the local Queens area who have long been associated with our center. You'll also find artifacts from the concentration camps and ghettos. And the exhibition focuses a lot on the different groups, as well as, again, how complicated the system was. You'll see here to the left, this is a wall that focuses on forced labor camps using stones that would have been used around that particular period of time. And as the wall progresses, there'll be a video spotlighting it. It will focus on the execution and extermination camps. The centerpiece of this exhibition is a 13 by 15 foot map focusing on just 2,000 of the 44,000 ghettos, concentration camps, satellite and subcamps, transit camps, and routes to extermination camps across the European countries, across the European continent. And that's really important to give a sense of the scale and scope of this system. So we hope you'll absolutely come by the KHC. There's catalogs, it's multimedia. You can listen to the survivors' testimonies, and you'll also find additional PowerPoint presentations, which as we move to the left of this video, will be playing on the wall round the clock. So coming back to this event, before we begin, we'd like to make sure that you submit all of your questions via the Q&A feature on your screen. And now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Ford and Professor White.
So I want to start by thanking Professors Cunahan, White, and Flaherty and the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for inviting me to speak about graphic genre and comic books and sequential art today. So I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about how I got into comics, because I was probably like a lot of you, where I started when I was a kid reading Archie and Batman and Superman comics and stuff. As a child, I was very interested in the Batman TV show and Robin, particularly because we shared the name. And as I became an adult, I discovered that DC Comics had decided to kill Robin, which was very upsetting. And that is what got me into actually collecting the Batman comics, both Detective and Batman, and then a bunch of the other Batman titles as well, because I wanted to see what was going on with my namesake. And by the time that they introduced a new Robin, I was definitely hooked. And as my interest grew and I spent more time in comic book stores, I moved from the superhero section to the so called adult or over 18 section, which had an imprint of DC Comics called Vertigo. And Vertigo was the more sophisticated and slightly more complex comics and graphic novels. So as I was getting older, these became more interesting to me, to the point where I eventually did my master's thesis on the graphic genre, specifically on Neil Gaiman's 75 issue series, The Sandman. Now I teach them. So I've taught March in several classes. Last year, I participated in the college's Common Read in teaching George Takei's They Called Us Enemy. And most of my classes, even if it's not specifically the graphic genre class, usually incorporate at least one work in the graphic genre of literature. So let's start with the seminal text about comics, and that's Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art. And so the next few slides that I'll be showing come directly from information from that book. So what are comics? Well, comics really, whether you call it graphic novels, comic books, or sequential art, what it is are images that are put in a sequence. So sequential art is Will Eisner's term. He coined that term. But as you can see with this example here, it's a sequence that transforms an image into a story. So here we have first just an image of a man holding a top hat. But then when you add another image to that with him lifting it, it tells a story or becomes a sequence or sequential art of the man lifting the top hat from his head. We have a sunset, someone being shot, time moving, and someone closing their eyes or blinking. Now, images. Well, an icon is an image that represents something. So for instance, if we look at this image on the right, it is a curved shape. It doesn't actually look like a human heart, but through time, we've come to read this as a heart. So we have a realistic version or image of a heart, and then we have the iconic image of the heart. And in the graphic genre, we use a lot of iconic images or things that represent other things. And so we might have to do a little bit of decoding of these to figure out what's going on. Right? So we have pictures, which is information that we receive instantly, right? We see it and we know what it is. Writing is a little bit different. Right? Words, we perceive them, but it's information that needs to be decoded in order to be understood. If you think about it as someone who is unable to read, right, then it's just marks on a paper or a screen. It's not until they're actually able to decode those marks that they become actual words and we can read what the meaning is behind them. So here we see the movement from a realistic face to basically a circle with two dots and a line, which we understand to be a face because we've decoded it in that way, to the letters FACE, which we can read to read face. And so we make meaning from both of these, the image and the words, when we're reading comics. So comics are made up of words and images, and these are generally separated in boxes that are sometimes, but not always, rectangular. Sometimes they're not even clearly delineated boxes, but these boxes or groups of words and images are called panels. As you can see here, we generally read the panels just like we're reading a book, from top to bottom and left to right. Although this isn't always the case. As we can see in this page, as we see, the first three are moving across. But then instead of going back over here, we're going down and then to the left and following the person jumping out the window and down and back. So sometimes it takes a little bit of effort to figure out the order to read the panels in, but it shouldn't require too much. And don't feel bad if you have to go back and reread it a few times. It happens to me all the time. So now there's various ways that things can change from panel to panel. And it's important when you're reading a comic to pay attention to this in order to really understand what's happening. So these transitions could be moment to moment, which is very simple. We don't need a lot of information to figure out what's going on, right? It's like the time. It was 5 o'clock, now it's 5:01. We see a clock. Right, action to action, where it's like a process of like the man taking the hat on and off. Again, we don't have to do a lot of reading and decoding to figure this out. And we have subject to subject, which is generally when you're looking at a panel, two panels, and it's the same scene, but we're switching the subject or the subject view. Right? So the way that I think of this is often like a film. So if the camera is focusing on two people talking and it moves from one person's face to then the focus on the other person's face, right? That would be subject to subject. And scene to scene is when there's some time passing. Say, for instance, we have a panel of a person eating their breakfast in their apartment. And then the next panel, they are in their car driving, right? So something has happened in between these two. They didn't just miraculously transport into that car, right? And we have to use our minds a little bit to fill in what occurred between these two panels. Aspect to aspect is another one. And this is one that we see several times in March, which is we're seeing the same scene, But in the next panel, we're seeing it from a different perspective. So we might get a close-up of someone, right? So we're focused on one thing, and that's bringing our attention to this one point in this scene. Or it might give us an overhead, like a bird's eye view of the scene. And then we have the non sequitur, and you don't really need to worry about that too much because this hardly ever happens, and it's more kind of avant-garde graphic novels that use this. But this is one where there's really no logical connection between what's going on in the panels. You have a penguin in one panel, and then the next panel you have astronauts on the moon, and you're like, wait, what? This makes no sense. Don't try to figure it out. So between the panels, there's a really important space called the gutter. Right? And so a lot happens in this space called the gutter. As a matter of fact, this is what McCloud says is really the heart of the comics. Okay. So in the gutter, the reader has to use their imagination to figure out what is going on in this space. And so we're taking these two separate images, these two panels, and transforming them into a single story. Right? And there's nothing that's actually happening there. It's just blank space, but our imaginations are filling this in. So for instance, here we have at the top, now you die. No, no. And we have a scene of a man with an axe that looks pretty sharp, and another man who's screaming, no, no, with his hands up, like he's about to get hit with the axe. Then we have the gutter. This is the space between the two panels. And then the next panel, we have a night cityscape, landscape scene here with somebody screaming, right? Now, you can probably figure out what's happening here, right? But the comic creator or artist has really not done anything there. Right? So, as McCloud says, every act committed to paper by the comic artist is aided and abetted by a silent accomplice, right? And that's you, the reader. He says, I may have drawn an axe being raised in this example, but I'm not the one who dropped it or decided how hard the blow or who screamed or why. That, dear reader, was your special crime, and each of you committed it in your own style. All of you participated in the murder. All of you held the axe and chose the spot. Right? So this is what the gutter does. And it leaves, just like in regular literature that's just prose, for example, it leaves certain things up to interpretation. Now, when you get to March and you're looking at it, if this is your first time reading a comic, it could be a little overwhelming. And there's a lot of information on the page, right? So there's all these various things happening, but you're supposed to be reading them all at once. So a couple of things. So we have generally narration or caption boxes. Sometimes they're in a box, sometimes it's just the way it is here in March at the top, right? We have speech bubbles. So speech bubbles are very clearly, they have the little tail going off, indicating who's speaking. Here we have the police officer speaking. Thought bubbles have little circular bubble-like tails to indicate that this is what someone is thinking, but not saying it loud. If someone is screaming or making some kind of a loud exclamation, often the speech bubble will have the jagged edges around to indicate this suddenness, shrillness, or loudness. And then there's various kinds of sound effects, which it could be something going zap or pow, right? Or in the case of March, we have the musical notes like here over We Shall Overcome, indicating that there's singing going on. This is being sung by the protesters as they're being put into the paddy wagons. So now the question becomes, which is more important, pictures or words? Well, with comics, there isn't an answer to that because they're both equally important. So we can take a look here at the script that Nate Powell, the artist, was given. So Lewis and Aiden's script says, panel 5, John Lewis is led from Woolworth stores, looking straight ahead across the block street with onlookers toward the waiting paddy wagons. The protesters sing as they are led out. Caption, I felt free, I felt liberated, I felt like I crossed over. And that then, the artist, Nate Powell, takes it and creates this page here. So we can see how it's transformed, and we can see how not only is it important for us to be looking at the words, right, but exactly what is going on in the images as well, right? The people grimacing as the police are accosting them, and their arms bent behind them. They're pushed down onto the ground, being pushed into the paddy wagon. The crowd of people outside of the Woolworths, right? The murmuring and mumbling of the crowd. And so it's important really to read all of that together. One thing that I found interesting in the script that Mr. Powell was kind enough to share with me was he made a artistic decision to show, don't tell, right? To illustrate something that the writers had said would be a caption. So in their idea, their script for this, they thought that they would need to be a caption saying they segregated the whites and the blacks into different vehicles. Powell felt it would be more poignant, and it would grab the attention more artistically to show this. And so we have here in his panel 2 different paddy wagons and the police officers saying, whites in that one, blacks in that one, right? So we're seeing this instead of being told that it's happening. Right? Some other things that are going on this page to pay attention to is the gutter, always. So we have these 2 panels, panel 1, panel 2, and these transitions are from aspect to aspect. So we have this one that's looking ahead at this, and then we get an overhead view of the same scene. So sort of a bird's eye view of what's going on, looking from above down onto the protesters being put into the police wagons. And then we have we have more gutter as some time has passed now, and we have moment to moment where they're being driven off. Here we have the inside of the paddy wagon, and then again a new aspect where we get a close-up of John Lewis's face to indicate, we are now supposed to be really paying close attention to him, to the protesters next to him, and really noticing the emotion in his face. Right? So we have in the script, it calls for a close-up of John Lewis. So final things to think about as you are reading March, you need to make sure that you're reading the images as well as the words. Don't forget that they're equally important. Fill in the gutter, Figure out what is happening between the panels if you get lost. And finally, don't overthink it. I mean, March is a fairly straightforward story, and there's not a lot that is left for you to have to figure out. There's no non sequiturs or no strange drawings. It's fairly straightforward, so you don't really need to overthink it too much. So I hope this has helped you to better understand comics and that it'll make reading March more enjoyable for you. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for having me here today, and I'm going to actually share a screen right now. This picture that I'm showing you, it's a picture from 1934, and these are students from the historically Black college, Howard University, our present Vice President Kamala Harris's alma mater. These students are protesting in 1934, 7 years before John Lewis was born. And they are protesting in Washington in front of a conference, the National Crime Conference. If you look at the students, you notice they have nooses around their necks. Every single student has a noose around their neck. And they are protesting lynching in America. They came together to call for an anti-lynching law to be passed in America. And even though an anti-lynching law, it has been in the Senate, it's been in the House of Representatives, to this day, an anti-lynching law has never been passed in America. Although an anti-lynching law has never been passed in America, these Howard University students still raise their voices to fight against social injustice in this country. And John Lewis would later walk in their shoes. A few decades later, he would also walk in their shoes. Okay. Right now, what I'm showing is a short PowerPoint about continuing the legacy of John Lewis. What John Lewis did in the 60s when he was with SNCC is he was continuing the legacy of those Howard University students by continuing to protest against social injustice in this country. And what John Lewis called protesting is getting into good trouble. John Lewis served after his years of protesting while he was a college student. He served in the US Congress for 33 years. He was also a leader in the civil rights movement while he was still a college student. He served as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and played a key role in the struggle to end segregation in America. I'm telling you some things for those students who've already started to read March. These are some things that you've probably already discussed in class. In 1951, when John Lewis was 11 years old, he traveled with his family from Alabama to Buffalo, New York. It was the first time that he had left the South. And on this particular trip, he saw that not all places in the United States were segregated like his hometown. When he returned to Alabama, Lewis and his cousins tried to saw down a large pine tree so they could build a wooden bus and escape from Alabama. This trip to New York would change John Lewis's life. When he came back home, he began to really think differently and really see the world differently. He grew because of that trip. So when he went to college in Nashville, John Lewis decided to join the struggle to fight social injustice. And he would continue his fight against social injustice until his death last year in 2020. In the last months of his life, John Lewis wrote that he was passing the baton of fighting social injustice to the next generation of people. In his final book, which my class is currently reading, we're reading it along with March, Carry On Reflections for a New Generation, John Lewis talked about passing on the baton to the next group of people, of young people. He also asked the following questions in his book, towards the end of his book, to those who might choose to follow in his path. And I have the questions that he asked here in his book. He asked, what is something that needs fixing in our country? What is something that doesn't sit right in your hearts that would move you to protest in a nonviolent way? John Lewis's description of good trouble is dramatizing something that needs changing or correcting. And for those of you joining us today, those students joining us today, I want you to think, if you can think about something in our society today that needs changing and correcting. What can you as a college student do to help change our troubled society? That's what I'd like you to think about right now as I go back to John Lewis's questions. The first two questions are really something that I'd like you to think about and to address right now while we're in this meeting. I'd like us to have a discussion. I'd like you to think about what is something that needs fixing, you think needs fixing in our country? And then what's something that doesn't sit right in your hearts that would move you to protest in a nonviolent way? Because you may think of something that needs fixing in our country, but it would not move you to protest. Those might be two different things. You might say, oh, this is something that isn't right. And then there's something that might make you put on your shoes and get out and make a poster and get out and protest with other people. So I'd like you to think about that right now. And what I'd like you to do is to just type up in the chat box. It doesn't have to be a complete sentence. What is something that you feel needs fixing, or what is something that would move you to protest in a nonviolent way? And then I'd like I'd like some students who are visiting, taking part in this today to, put on your microphones and speak. We can also look in the chat box at what you have written. So if you could just do that right now. And if you don't want to participate, you can just watch what other students do. I know some of my students are here, so I certainly would like you to add your voice, because this is something we've been discussing in class for these last few weeks. Okay, so I'll just leave this question up for a second, and then I'm going to return and look in the chat box and see if anyone has added something in the chat box. Okay, so I want you to think, what is something that needs fixing in our country? And what doesn't sit right in your hearts? And this is a direct quote from John Lewis's book that would move you to protest in a nonviolent way. Okay, I see a few students are saying economic imbalance, the need for a living wage. And that is Melanie who said that. Sonia is saying cultural intolerance in school. Nicole is saying racism and police brutality. Diamond has says, well, the way cops treat American people. Roberto says racism is still alive in America. Justin says gun violence, especially in school. Genesis says less violence and more peace. Sharifa says all the shootings of the Black people in America by cops. Another student, Sharifa says corrupt cops. Elizabeth says immigration needs fixing. Vaughn says gun violence. Mary says be treated equally. Karina says immigration issues. Karina says inequality in social classes. Let me just ask, okay, I have another student here who's answered, so I'm going to look at that. Gender inequality needs to disappear. Okay, and another student says gun violence. So we see a lot of issues that certainly are issues we keep hearing about on the news. We can see it on the streets. And John Lewis would ask, what can students do about it? What do you think students can do about it, especially if you have started reading March and you see what the students in March did, how they put together and organized, and they organized in, they really prepared themselves before they got out there. What do you think can happen now? We see the Black Lives Matter movement. Is there any other movement that should happen, or what do you think could be done by students? You're students now, and these were students who got together and decided we're going to do something. What do you think students could do? Okay, I see more students, more people are answering. More people are saying cost of living is too expensive. The immigration issue, I'd like the American people to acknowledge that we're all immigrants, is Roberto says. John says, speak up, tell others around you, empower young folks. That's very good. Frank Otis says, cost of living is too expensive nowadays. Sophie says our educational system needs fixing. We see a lot of answers here. Sharifa saying, speak up. So let me just ask Sharifa, you think that not enough people speak up? You think more people need to speak up? Okay, Nicole says, unfortunately for me, these issues anger me, so I'm unsure if I can peacefully protest against police brutality. Nicole, that's very interesting because I had a student ask me about the students in the SNCC movement. He said, were all of the students peaceful? Were they all nonviolent? That's actually a good question. They were supposed to be all nonviolent, but what would be interesting for research is to find out what would actually happen to people in the organization. Would they be thrown out? The SNCC organization did shift, and my students and I would be looking at the shifting of it after John Lewis no longer was the head of the organization. It changed when Stokely Carmichael took over the organization. But that is very interesting that it angers some people that they may not be able to stay peaceful or nonviolent. Leslie says people like-minded can get together to change issues that need fixing. That's very good, Leslie. Sharifa says absolutely. Sonia says use their knowledge and skills to serve in student groups and organizations on campus. Cherry Ann says maybe not to generalize a movement and make a movement for the people. I think you're giving excellent answers. John says, follow the news, but don't be blinded by it. If you don't know something, look it up, research, and try to be open-minded. My students and I in class this week, we were looking at something that happened on the news and we're analyzing it and really wondering that we needed more answers. Anyone else have anything? So what can be done? I like the idea that students can explore these issues through their class assignments, says Melanie, which is also certainly good that students can do that too. Students getting together on campus and exploring these issues. Okay, no more open questions. That certainly is good as well. Do you think that a student organization these days as organized as SNCC could happen again? Do you think that, and if you, I don't know how far you've read in March, but we saw that in Nashville, there were students coming from many schools that were coming together. So could something like this happen again, you think? Nicole, while I'm waiting for answers for that, do you think there could be an organization that could come together, even in New York, that we've had, say, New York students come together from different schools, maybe even different CUNY schools to start an organization? While I'm waiting for that answer, Nicole says racism and hatred is a taught mindset. I believe it comes from the household first. So how could, Roberto says definitely can happen that there could be students to organize like students did during John Lewis's time, that could happen. Does anyone else think that could happen, that there could come a time when students could come together and organize from different schools, like in New York, like students from Queensborough and City College and Hunter and Columbia, New York University could come together and organize? And you notice how people organized during that time. It was a very studied way that they organized and then protested in a very intellectual way, just how it was put together was done. Okay, does anybody else think it can happen? Roberto says it can happen. It can definitely happen. Does anyone else think it can happen? Well, I, for one, think it could happen too. I, for one, think it could happen because students, okay, Sophie says, I think we saw a bit of this happen after the Parkland shooting in Florida. So yes, I do believe it can happen. And Sophie, you are exactly right. We saw students from Parkland who came together and went all the way to Washington just through their own organization. Sherry Ann says yes, and social media will be a huge outlet. Word will spread faster. Yes, that's true. Social media certainly can be a positive, different outlet for people to spread the word. Sharifa says it could happen. We need strong leaders. You're right, Sharifa. Strong leaders are needed. And if you really would, if you, did research more beyond John Lewis during the student, during the SNCC, when the leadership changed, things changed for the students and that organization. Leslie said, yes, it can happen for sure. Nicole says, yes, we can come together. It will be a lifelong protest. Leslie Campos says, I think before this happens, there may be a need for someone to be a leader and motivate others to act in an organized plan. So Leslie is saying that there needs to be a leader to organize things. I think you're exactly right, Leslie, about that, because we have seen other movements where there are leaderless movements, and those leaderless movements sometimes fall apart because there's not someone to bring people together. That certainly has happened in the past. Mary says, the united people will never be defeated. We have to raise our voices and never ignore what is going on in our country. I think it can happen if we work together. That's a really good answer, Mary. Sonia says, Black and Puerto Rican students mobilized into campus movement in protest of relevant courses, support services, and other engagement initiatives at City College in 1969. Okay, and if students did that in 1969, and what are we seeing? If you think about seeing the students from 1934, now we're talking about students from 1969, John Lewis being just a little bit more before that time and sort of drifting into that time, we're looking at students organizing and getting things done. Allison said, a beautiful message from John Lewis and in the book is that great leaders are made by ordinary people who are brave enough to speak up and act. And that's very right, that great leaders are made up by ordinary people who are brave enough to speak up and act. And you're not looking, no one is born with leader on their head. These are ordinary people who come from all walks of life. John Lewis coming from a small place in Alabama, and his parents were sharecroppers, to end up being a leader and to continuing to lead until his death. Okay, does any other student have any other ideas about that? I see that there are a lot of people say that this is something that can happen again. And what you're saying is people need to organize. And if we think about the picture of the students in 1934 from Howard University, we saw a small group of students there. But what were the students? The students all came from the same school. They were united. They were united that they decided that they were going to wear the nooses around their necks and they were going to be brave. You saw that they were wearing coats and the young men had on hats. There were some women that had on hats too, a small number, but the thing was organization and standing together. So that certainly shows us, and then we look at John Lewis, the same thing happened with how the students organized and they worked together. And these were ordinary people who stood together to change things. And I think sometimes people think that a quote from John Lewis's book, his final book, is that people asked how he wanted to be remembered. He said he wanted to be remembered as a boy who came from Alabama, who saw something, who said something, and who did something. And that's how he wants to be remembered, as just a small boy from a farm in Alabama. And he spoke up. And that's what he's telling people that they should do. Those who would protest and carry on the torch of protest and wanting to change society. He wants, students and those people who will speak and fight social injustice to continue the fight that he joined. Because we certainly see that John Lewis and that organization were not the first people to protest, and they won't be the last, and it should continue with other students too. And this concludes actually my presentation. Oh, okay, so Melanie Lee says The New Wonder Years is set in Alabama with a Black family. First episode dealt with Martin Luther King assassination. Okay, so we have a show that is dealing with the assassination of Martin Luther King and a Black family. And this is certainly different because The Wonder Years originally was about a white family. Now we have it about a Black family set in the 60s in Alabama. Okay, so this concludes my presentation. I want to thank you for allowing me to talk to you a little bit about students and John Lewis and the necessity to raise our voice and change things, and it can come from just ordinary people. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor White and Dr.
You're welcome.
Cooper. I mean, I think that this novel is really important because it talks about the role of activism, and it talks about what people can do in the face of oppression and violence and a system that is intent on destroying people. And one of the things that I find so inspirational is that it kind of provides a guide, not only for then, but making the connection between history and what's happening in our country now. This is the importance of history, is understanding what those lessons are. And sometimes those lessons are, there's violence and there's horror, but there's also lessons of people rising up together to make it a better world. And I'm so grateful that you both presented on this, and also for all of the students who submitted their questions and their comments via the Q&A feature. We're really, really grateful. And I also wanted to thank this year's Welcome Read coordinators, Dr. Beth Cunahan, Associate Professor of English, and also Bonnie Flaherty, the Director of the CUNY START program. And there's another event happening next week with Nate Powell, who is the illustrator of March Book One, and he's going to be in conversation with QCC's very own president, Dr. Christine Mangino. So thank you to everyone. We hope that you stay safe. We hope that you stay well, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Stay safe, be well, everyone.